In 1973, 120 people met at Vanderbilt University for a family reunion. They were all descendants of Cornelius Vanderbilt, who had once been the richest man in America. A family historian stood up to address the room. He told them that not one person present was a millionaire. 96 years earlier, the man they were descended from had died holding more money than the United States Treasury. This is the arithmetic of how that disappeared, and it is not a story about a crash, or a war, or a bad investment. Nothing was stolen, nothing collapsed. The money was simply spent by people who were certain it could not run out. Cornelius Vanderbilt was born in 1794 on Staten Island into a farming family with no money and no name. At 16, he borrowed $100 from his mother and bought a flat-bottomed boat. He ran people and freight across New York Harbor, and he did it on time, at lower prices, in weather other men wouldn't sail in. That is the entire origin. No inheritance, no patron, no education past 11. By his 30s, he had a fleet. By his 40s, he had moved into steamships and was undercutting every competitor on the Atlantic run so aggressively that rivals paid him to stop, and he took the money and started another line somewhere else. Then, in his late 60s, at an age when most men of the period were finished, he sold the ships and bought railroads. That was the decision that made the fortune enormous. He consolidated lines into the New York Central, and by the end, he controlled the rail traffic into the largest city in America. It is worth being clear about how he did it, because it explains what his descendants lost. Vanderbilt's method was not invention. He did not build a better engine or discover a new route. What he did was find the point where a competitor was vulnerable and then apply pressure until they sold. He cut fares below cost and outlasted people. He bought the connecting line a rival depended on and closed it. He was, by the accounts of men who dealt with him, almost entirely without sentiment in business and perfectly willing to be hated. That is a temperament, not a technique. And temperament is the one thing an inheritance cannot transfer. When he died in January 1877, he left about $105 million. To understand that number, the entire United States Treasury held less. One man, who had started with a rowing boat, personally held more currency than the federal government of the country he lived in. And here is the first decision that mattered. He left 95% of it to one son. William Henry Vanderbilt was 55, and his father had spent most of his life telling him he was a fool. He got almost everything, and the rest of the family got comparatively little, and several of them sued. The son turned out not to be a fool. In 8 years, William Henry doubled it. By his death in 1885, the Vanderbilt fortune stood at around $200 million, the largest in the world. Then he divided it among 8 children. That is the hinge. 2 generations of accumulation, and then, in a single document, the fortune stopped being one enormous engine and became 8 large piles of money. A pile of money is not a business. It doesn't compound unless someone works it. And the 3rd generation did not work it. They spent it. And they spent it in a very particular way because they had a problem their grandfather never had. The Vanderbilts were rich, but they were not accepted. Old New York society, the Astors and the families around them, regarded railroad money as vulgar. Mrs. Astor famously would not call on them. So, in March 1883, Alva Vanderbilt threw a costume ball at her new house on 5th Avenue. 1,200 guests. Estimates put the cost around $250,000 in 1883, and she let it be known that Mrs. Astor's daughter had not been invited, because the two families had never formally met. Mrs. Astor called. The ball worked, and it established the family strategy for the next 40 years. Spend visibly and buy your way in. What followed was the building. Marble House at Newport, finished in 1892, cost about $11 million. $7 million of that was the marble alone. It was a summer cottage. They used it roughly 1 month a year. Then the Breakers, finished in 1895. 70 rooms, a staff of 40. Between the two houses, the annual cost of simply keeping them standing ran to about $1 million a year, at a time when a comfortable American household lived on $2,000. At the peak, the family owned 10 mansions on Fifth Avenue alone. It is difficult now to picture what that meant day to day. The Breakers ran with a household staff of about 40 people, for a building occupied by a handful of family members for a few weeks each summer. There were servants whose entire function was the maintenance of rooms that were essentially never entered. The houses were not homes in any ordinary sense. They were arguments made in stone about who the family were, and they had to be maintained whether anyone was listening or not. And in 1895, they made the trade that shows the logic most clearly. Consuelo Vanderbilt was 18 years old and in love with someone else. Her mother had decided she would marry Charles Spencer Churchill, the 9th Duke of Marlborough, who had a title, an enormous crumbling estate, and no money. Consuelo refused. Her mother told her the stress was going to kill her. Consuelo was confined to the house. She married him on the 6th of November, 1895, and reportedly wept behind her veil at the altar. About $2.5 million went with her, and more after. Blenheim Palace was repaired. The Vanderbilts had bought a duchess. They separated 11 years later. Now the mathematics. Consider what was actually happening across those decades. The fortune was being divided at every generation, 8 ways, then further. It was producing no new income because railroads were being regulated and no Vanderbilt after William Henry ran the business seriously. It was being spent at a rate that would have embarrassed a small government. And then, in 1916, the federal estate tax arrived and took a share at every death. Divided, static, spent, and taxed. Any one of those is survivable. All 4 at once is not. The houses went first. In 1926, the Cornelius Vanderbilt II mansion at 1 West 57th Street, the largest private house ever built in New York City, was demolished. It had stood for 34 years. The following year, 660 Fifth Avenue, where the costume ball had been held, came down too. Not sold, demolished. Because the land underneath was worth more than the house on top of it, and nobody in the family could afford the upkeep. Of the 10 Fifth Avenue mansions, not one is standing today. Which brings us back to that room in 1973. 120 people, 1 surname, and the largest fortune in American history somewhere behind them, gone. They were not destitute. That is worth saying plainly, because the story is often told as though the Vanderbilts ended in poverty. And they did not. They were, by 1973, ordinary, teachers and lawyers and people with jobs, which is in its way the more striking outcome, not ruin, but simple reversion. 4 generations after a man held more money than the Treasury, his descendants had been returned to the same middle of the country everyone else occupies. The Breakers survives, and Marble House survives, and you can walk through both of them because the family gave them to the Preservation Society when they could no longer pay for them. You buy a ticket at the door. It took 3 generations. The first man built it, the second doubled it, the third only spent it. And that is the whole arithmetic. If you want the long version, the ferries, the Commodore's war with the Erie Railroad, Consuelo's life after the Duke, and where every one of those houses went, There is a full 90-minute documentary on this channel, made to fall asleep to.